Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nathan. I am one of the 3 executive directors of the Election Truth Alliance. And in this video, we're going to be going over our special report for Minnesota. We're going to talk about a few things before we jump into the Minnesota related stuff. I've got a nice little summary here for you. So as you know, the ETA, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, or, looking at investigating the 24 election and, the systems and the practices we use. So we're going to go over a few things. We're going to look at Dieselgate as an example of some concerns with systems, with machines. Then we're going to jump into a little bit of the, let's see here, the U.S. voting systems we use across the country, across multiple states. Then we're going to get into the actual hand count data that we've pulled for Minnesota. And we've talked about it briefly on a few of our recent visits for David Packman. We have a report up on our website, and we're just going to highlight that for you here. So first, let's start with Dieselgate. What is Dieselgate? If you recall, Dieselgate was a scandal, emissions scandal for diesel vehicles for Volkswagen. And pretty much what had happened was sometime between 2009, 2015, Volkswagen had intentionally programmed a audit defeating software hack on their 2 and 3 liter diesel engine vehicles. And when those systems and those vehicles were being tested, emissions testing, they would go into emissions control and have normal emissions output. But on the road, that software would then, crank up emissions to, I think, over 40 times the legal limit. So that was a software that would pretty much know if the vehicles were being tested or not being driven. So the reason why this was caught and was a big deal was the International Council on Clean Transportation, ICCT, nonprofit research group. They were skeptical about Volkswagen. The European lab test, the data was showing really high emissions, but then they couldn't account for it. So the data didn't add up, right? The math wasn't mathing. So what they did, they teamed up with West Virginia University Center, and pretty much on the right, as you can see here, they attached testing kits to the vehicles themselves, right? And then they drove them on the highway. And that is where they determined that there was a software that was built to detect and defeat emissions testing. Now, we bring this up because this is an example of where systems, machines, hardware and software came together to defeat audits, defeat testing. And we asked the same question is, so could the same thing be done with election systems, right? Could you design a way, whether it's software based or not, to defeat audits and do something, whether it's manipulate emissions or maybe manipulate votes? So let's talk very briefly about the election systems in the US. Most people aren't aware of this. We've been hammering this home for a while now. 60 to 70% of the US uses one major brand, which is ES&S. And that's displayed here in blue. Spans multiple states, multiple swing states, good mix. And then you have Dominion, which is 25-30%, and then you have Hardtender Civic 5 to 10. So these are the 3 major brands in the US. They span multiple counties and multiple states. And what's interesting is they have multiple systems of both voting systems and tabulation systems. And the reason why we bring this up is if you were to compromise these brands through a supply chain or some other form of manipulation, they span multiple places. So the most common pushback we get is in order to manipulate an election, it would require a lot of work. It would require compromising multiple systems. You only have 3 major systems. And even then, ES&S, 70% of the US. So if you compromise that one major system, whether through malware on those systems, you could potentially impact 70% of the US's voting. So that's just one issue. Now, let's talk very briefly about the 2 types of systems we're really going to cover, and then we'll jump into some of the data. So we're going to talk about electronic voting machines. These come up a lot, but these actually aren't that prevalent. They're really only about up to 23-24% of the systems we actually use. 80% of votes are generally hand-marked paper ballots. So you go and you hand-mark your paper ballot. So these aren't a big deal. Electronic voting machines aren't very common on the grand scale of things in the US. For the 24 election, as I said, mostly hand-marked paper ballots or a mix of ballot marking devices. But we do have voting machines used in the swing states. I know Nevada, Clark County uses the direct recording electronic machines. And here's the caveat. So these direct recording electronic machines, DREs, they are a touchscreen. They store the vote internally. They can have a little paper trail, but like once you cast your vote, it's sent off digitally. And then there's no scanning of anything. Ballot marking devices, which are far more common, that's like 88% of electronic voting machines. They are like touchscreen, and you print out a ballot and then you scan it with another system. I'm scanned by like an optical scanner. But as I said, these are very rare, not very common, but we do have concerns about these nonetheless. What we're more focused on, and what we talk about a lot in our data, in our public speaking, is these. These are the tabulators. These are what count your votes. These are the vote counting computers. They come up a lot in public statements that we raise red flags for, especially in Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, when we talk about these, nearly 100% of votes cast in the 24 election were counted by a tabulation machine. Whether it's at the precinct level or the county level, mail-in included, is counted by a tabulation machine. You have two major types. There is a third type, it's like a hybrid that combines electronic voting and tabulation. But generally speaking, we've got optical scanners, very common at the precinct level. You either hand mark or you machine mark your ballot, and then you feed them into these scanners at the precinct level, and then they digitally capture your vote, and that gets transferred to the county. And then you have your central tabulators, which process your mail-in voting. Sometimes we'll aggregate combined data at the county level for other systems. So these are your two major types. And we bring these up because these have started to raise concerns. If you could compromise these machines, which are used almost everywhere, could you manipulate votes, right? Could you change votes? Could you add votes in? That is our concern as we go forward. Now, here's some things we're going to bring up. How could we know, right? So we talked about Volkswagen, we talked about Dieselgate, we talked about software that could defeat audits and tests. So how could we know if a major voting system, a major tabulator system was compromised? How could we know? How could we detect it? So remember Dieselgate, they had data that didn't make sense. They had emissions that were greater than what was being reported. They had audits, but then those audits didn't catch anything, right? And so we bring up the same concerns here. We do have audits in the US. Many states do post-election audits, but these audits are generally small in scope. They're generally a sample, 2%, for example. And so you'll randomly select precincts across multiple counties, and then you'll count them. Whether you'll count them, actually with the machines again or by hand, it varies. Then you also have tests of the machines. Almost everywhere they test the machine before or after the election to make sure it counts correctly. The reason why we are concerned is it would be very easy if you could compromise these machines and put malware on them to defeat the testing of the machines. A timed window would allow you to manipulate votes only during that window, and testing the machines before or after the election would never catch that. When it comes to the audits, we've started finding that many of the audits that are conducted generally are undersampling the places that our statistical analysis is raising red flags in, right? We're seeing concerns in some of the highest turnout precincts in the counties and in the states, but then audits generally are randomly selected, but they don't focus in on those really high turnout areas. They focus like smaller areas, smaller precincts. So we are concerned that these audits may not actually be catching vote manipulation in the places it's happening. Because a sample wouldn't catch targeted vote manipulation, because a sample would be really good if there were errors and maybe 2% of the votes were being miscounted on average because the machines weren't working right. But a malicious compromise could defeat the normal audits we do right now. So as I said, how can we catch this, right? So if our audits may not catch this, and if there is a compromise, the audits are being defeated, well then the data, as what happened with Volkswagen, nonprofit organizations started looking at the data. And that's what we've started doing at the ETA, is we're using statistics to look at elections. We're using statistics that have been used to determine election fraud in European and Russian and everything like that, elections in the past. And we're applying the same methods to the US right now. And we are finding red flags, and we're prompting for investigation in those places. And that's your 3 points there. So let's jump in a little bit of the data and the tests. So we do have 2 major tests we're really going to talk about. We're more or less going to talk about scatter plots, less about histograms, but this is just a way of visualizing precinct level voting data or machine level voting data, depending on what type. And I'll show you what normal looks like. So as I said, this report that I'm about to go over, the data I'm pulling from this is on our website already, Special Report Minnesota. So go to electiontruthealliance.org. You can look this up under our analysis and read even more in depth, but I'm going to kind of hit you with the highlights here. So why Minnesota? So Minnesota is not a swing state. Minnesota in the 24 election, it was actually won by Harris for about 51% of the vote or so. Now Biden won the same state in 2020 for about 52 or so. And it's displayed on the right, and we're going to focus on District 8 because District 8 has machine count precincts like normal, like everywhere, but they also have hand-counted precincts. The precincts were small enough they counted them by hand. Now, a caveat here, because these precincts are hand-counted and they're smaller, they're generally going to be more rural. They're generally going to probably lean more right, more Republican, and that's fine. That's normal. But we're going to look at them statistically, and that's the point of doing this. And then, Minnesota, as I said, it's 10 electoral college votes. 3 major brands were used here, but mostly you're going to see the ES&S, the DS200 precincts, and the central count systems. And the reason why we bring this up is, why is Minnesota important? Well, if you use the same systems all across the US, and there was a compromise of these systems, and these systems are manipulating votes, you're still going to have problems in places that may not have actually been the outcome of the presidential race or whatnot been changed, which is interesting, right? Because you would think, if I'm going to cheat, I'm going to cheat in places I need to win. But we're raising the concern now where everywhere we've looked that uses these systems starts to bring concerns. So it's no longer a question of targeting certain states, but perhaps slow and gradual manipulation of votes across the board. So it's very interesting that Minnesota, a non-swing state, is exhibiting some of these concerns that we're seeing in swing states, in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, in Nevada. So what I'm going to show you now, I'm going to show you the data we have for Minnesota specifically. And this is on our website. This is, on our report, but we're going to look at District 8 because District 8 has those hand count precincts. So on the left, same concept here. We have machine count votes. In this case, these are precincts. And really what we're showing you, and I'll actually break it out in a following slide, but remember how we said a more expected pattern should be a bit more of a straight line, right? From once you get into really high turnout, you should begin to sit somewhere, on the average. Now on the right is hand count vote. So the x-axis for both of these graphs is turnout. The y-axis is vote share, like we said. And then we have Harris as the blue coloring and Trump as the red coloring for the presidential race. We do have a third-party candidate here. That's just the other vote share precinct totals. Now, as I said, we should see or expect to see a bit more of a straight line. And that is generally what we're getting for these hand count precincts. These hand count precincts, we don't see any aggressive shifts in precincts of high turnout versus precincts of low turnout. There are some limitations here. First and foremost, we don't have a huge amount of data as compared to the machine count data. So this is a smaller sample size. These are more rural areas, which is why you would argue the vote share for Trump should be relatively high. Those are his demographic of voters. That's perfectly fine. What we're actually looking at here is less of where the votes are laying and more about the shape of those precincts and those votes. And so, as I said, hand count looks statistically more normal. We don't see a huge change in turnout versus vote share for any one candidate. It's somewhat consistent. Now on the left, with the machine count precincts, we see a huge concern with precincts of low turnout favoring Democratic candidates and having a higher vote share for Harris. But then as you look at precincts with more and more turnout, we begin to see Harris dropping in votes she's getting across those precincts, and Trump aggressively growing in the amount of votes he's getting at higher turnout. This is a concern. This is a concern because this is consistent with what's been seen in Russian elections. This is the same pattern we're seeing in Pennsylvania in some of the most blue counties like Philadelphia. This is the same pattern we're seeing in North Carolina. We're seeing, as you saw in Nevada. I mean, this is a snapshot, by the way. So this is after all the votes are cast. We're seeing that in precincts of lower turnout versus higher turnout, if we go by 10 points, so 50% versus 60% versus 70% turnout, we're actually seeing around 10, 11, or 12 points each time you go up for Trump. That is a really high correlation. What that pretty much means is in precincts of 70% turnout versus precincts of 80% turnout, Trump is gaining almost in lockstep. Higher turnout, more votes. And it creates this effect, and it creates the trend line we're seeing on the left here. This is a huge concern. This doesn't really match what you would expect a free and fair election to look like. We visualized it again here for you just to make it easier to see. What we've done is this is a binning technique. We've shown a few of these before, and what it is the x-axis is just the same. It's the turnout, but we're grouping the scatter plot precincts. So these are precincts, we're grouping them by 10% increments. So on the left, we have precincts that fall within the 30% range. We have precincts that fall within that 40% range. And then we just kind of go up from there. And what we're seeing, same effect I'm saying, we're seeing that low turnout precincts heavily favor Democrats. And then as you get to higher turnout precincts where more votes were cast, you begin to see an effect where the Republicans begin to gain a higher and higher percentage of the vote, and then actually begin to overtake, in some cases, in some precincts, Harris gets overtaken, and Trump actually begins to win precincts of higher turnout. And so that is kind of the statistical look at it. As I said, some limitations, small data sets, but nonetheless, very concerning where we're seeing machine counted votes exhibiting those effects. We did compare this, and what we've done here is we've actually looked at the presidential race, the Senate race, and the House race for Minnesota District 8. And what we're actually looking at is we're looking at the average machine count versus the average hand count for these precincts, and we actually matched the precinct sizes. So we said, let's look at all of the precincts that are within the same amount of registered voters. And really what you're looking at is these are the same demographics of voters, arguably. That's the assumption, at least. And you're saying, these are rural, smaller areas. So they should all vote the same. Hand counted, machine counted. We should see some of the same effects, but we don't. What we see is when we compare them, we're actually finding that there is an average of around 6 to 8% shift benefiting Trump or benefiting a Republican candidate for machine counted votes. So precincts that machine counted their votes, we see the Republican candidates getting anywhere from 6 to 8% on average more votes. In the House, it's a little lower, closer to 5 and 6. And so this is concerning because if there was a compromise of our voting systems, this would be an effect. So as I said, this isn't proof of election fraud. Statistics is at best evidence that warrants investigation. But if our machines were compromised and you were manipulating votes for your party, for example, across multiple races, it would create an effect where there would be a noticeable difference from hand count versus machine count precincts. And we do see a noticeable difference. And so we flagged this as very concerning. As I said, as you kind of dig deeper into this, we've started looking into the machines we use, and ultimately our push now is we're saying this warrants investigation. So we need to be investigating these precincts that are having these differences. We should be looking at the ballots. So to kind of summarize and wrap up then, as I said, is what can we do about it, right? So statistics alone isn't evidence of election fraud. It is, it is a indicator at best. It flags where you should go look and where you should go investigate. And so that is what our push is. A reason why we wanted to focus this is a really good example of, this is a blue state where the outcome if there was vote manipulation, statistically speaking, it doesn't seem to benefit the candidate that still won the state for the presidential race. And it still warrants investigation, even if it doesn't change the outcome of the race, because election fraud is criminal nonetheless. And if it is tied to the machines, which we raised the concern it may be if this is vote manipulation, because everywhere the machines are being used, we're seeing these effects exhibited, then this is a good opportunity. Excuse me. This is a good opportunity because if we can get an investigation in this state and an investigation to hand count the ballots in these precincts that were machine counted originally, then if there is election fraud, it could be discovered here, and then we can scale up and out to investigating anywhere and everywhere that use these machines. So that's why this is important. So call to action for you guys. First and foremost, sign up for newsletter updates. You can put your email address in here. You get updates directly to your inbox. We've sent out a few already. This is the most direct way for us to reach you. Also, Audit Advocacy Toolkit on our website, electiontruthealliance.org. This is where we, as we progress, will put out any further calls to actions. We provide a few different bits of info. We actually have a PDF here that gives you some templates where you can reach out to your state or local offices, and we've kind of talked through some of the talking points for you. So check this out as we get involved, as we do mentions and say, let's go talk to certain people. This is what we're going to rely on. We plan to send the Minnesota data to the Secretary of State of Minnesota and the governor as well. So pending any follow-up calls to action, this is going to be involved here. We also have promotional material. You've probably seen some of this online. You can download these, you can print them out, you can hand them out. So if you do go to some type of event, these are really awesome to kind of break the ice and start showing and talking about some of our stuff. We've got cool little visuals of how some of that data or some of the concerns break down. So I love these a lot. And we got some other flyers as well thrown here at the bottom. So our team has been killing it on making these for you guys so that you can take this with you and share and spread the word. Now, if you do want to join the movement, as I say, go to electiontruthealliance.org. All of this is either in Get Involved or under Advocacy Materials. You can volunteer, sign up. So we do have different skill sets, so data-related skill sets, legal services, admin, so like managing different things. We've got graphic and media. So any type of stuff like this, if you've got these skills, please reach out. We will follow up. We're pretty good about going back through, and if we don't, for some reason, get back to you in a timely manner and you really want to jump in, shoot us an email at our board, electiontruthealliance.org email address. I check that pretty regularly, and the team does as well. Now, finally, as you guys know, as I've talked about, we're doing this work, and the next big push, right, as we go forward and we keep doing these investigations, the ETA has been on the ground. The next step is going to be actually investigating, whether it's requiring us to use legal action to do so, or we can get the states themselves to step forward. That's kind of where the money that you guys have been donating to us is going, is fighting that fight and doing the analysis and paying for some of the services and equipment that we use and getting things done. And if you don't want to donate, we've got some merch you can put up or put on or put out, right? I like the shirts just because you get to wear them and it's not really too crazy. I like the pins as well. I was going to put these on some of my things, but these are just simple ways of kind of spreading the message. I'd say as we progress and some of the things that we're going to be making public here in the near future comes out, this is an easy way to bring attention to the concerns. I'll say this. Statistical data right now tells us where to go look. And the other half of the battle is then actually doing the investigations, scaling things up and out. And I will say as we move forward, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about this more as we go forward, but the ETA has been on the ground doing some of these investigations and building the legal cases that it would take to confirm was there manipulation or was there not. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much. We'll have more updates as we go forward going into next week. And I'll just say, keep fighting, share the word, and don't lose hope. We're wanting to investigate, and I think we're getting very close to making this a much bigger deal and having a lot of people take this very seriously. But I need you to keep pushing in the meantime. If you haven't already, like the video, leave us a comment, share with your friends and family. And then if you aren't subscribed, subscribe. And if you are subscribed, make sure you hit the notification bell, because that'll give you updated notifications. So thank you very much. You guys stay safe.